I would take this question, but I am going to try to just let me tell the whole story. We will do questions generally then. The UN, the UN could. The goal is to sell those buildings to the highest bidder, because the goal is to get, once if we're giving up this parkland in part to generate cash from that transaction, the goal is going to be to sell it to the highest bidder. If the UN, for whatever reason, decided they wanted to buy more buildings on the east side, conceivably, that seems unlikely to me, conceivably they could bid and they could be the person who most wants to pay cash for those buildings and buy them. But the more likely outcome is the UN is now, they're getting a new consolidation building, which is connected to their campus, which is an important goal. You can't connect UN 1 and 2 to their campus. So the likely outcome is they get out of those buildings, they're sold for market price, which is not possible right now while the UN currently occupies those buildings at a very below market rent, which is why it's difficult to sell them at a high price that would generate all this cash. So basically the deal is that the city has to continue to seek a price for this. At some point the price becomes sufficient to cover the projects, the buildings are sold, it's an obligation of the city to sell them. At that point the city gets, this is where it gets a little tricky. There are, the way the money is divided into we're calling them tranches. Forgive if you didn't like alienation. A tranche is a term in structured finance that basically is like a slice of the transaction. So you imagine you got a transaction and it's a pie, and one person's getting one portion and another person's getting another portion. Each of the slices of the pie is called a tranche. Okay, and I'm using that term because you are likely to actually see that in the formal MOU, which eventually will be out in the public domain. So I don't want to make up an easier word tonight and then you'll be like, where did the slices go? Okay, so there are 4 slices. Okay, the first slice is the city's break-even value. It's the value of that cash they've been taking in. So if you're taking, just like, imagine you have an apartment and you take in $800, you're a landlord and you take in $800 a month into an apartment. The right to collect $800 a month forever is worth some amount of money to you. It's not just worth $800 times the number of months forever, right? It's like cash now is better than cash later. So there's something called the present value of that money. The amount of money that the right to collect that money is worth to you is basically what the city is calling its break-even value. So they will first get that money, so the taxpayers of the city of New York are not losing out in this deal. Okay. The second tranche would be the money, the first money that goes to the community out of this transaction. Remember, they've already gotten $65 million or so from the sale of the Robert Moses site. This number would be $190 million minus whatever they got for the Robert Moses site. So if that number ends up getting pegged at $65 million, the second tranche would be $125 million of additional money for the community, again, subject to getting a purchase price for the buildings that allows that money to be generated. Okay. The third tranche, and we're almost done with the tranches, the third tranche is basically the money above the break-even value. For the sake of example, let's say the break-even value is $100 million. Let's say the second tranche is 125 because it's 190 minus 65. So now you've sold if you sell the buildings in that example for more than $225 million, the money above that amount would be split between the city and the community projects, up to a potential of not 190 but $220 million for the community. So we could basically get $30 million more than we currently think all of the projects we've already talked about are going to cost. Beyond that, the city says, well, we want to be generous to this community, but if we end up selling the buildings for $1 billion, we're not going to put $800 million in a fund for community projects on the east side. So above that is called the fourth tranche, and the city taxpayers get that money. And presumably that keeps your taxes low and keeps other services in the city going. Okay. Just to run through the bottom line of this, the dollars. There is a $13 million payment up front that Con Ed must pay to the city before any of this happens that allows for the structural rehabilitation of Con Ed Pier. There is a $3 million payment from UNDC to the city that must be made before the transfer of the site. There is a payment of, we think, $65 million or so, it's still being negotiated, that the UNDC would make to the city and the community would get every penny of that for the community projects. And the last transaction is the amount of money is going to be up in the air depending on how much the buildings are sold for. But the goal would be to get roughly, in today's dollars, escalated for inflation and all those other things. And I spared you talking about inflation so far in this conversation. All the dollars that we're talking about as if are in today's dollars without inflation. But all of these things will be escalated for inflation. But roughly speaking, you get the equivalent of what might be up to $125 to $155 million upon those buildings being sold. Now, I mentioned before the timing of this is very hard to predict, but based on some rough projections we've done, we think it is likely that the sale of UN 1 and 2 starts to look like it's going to generate all the cash for the remaining projects the latter part of this decade, meaning something with a 1 on it and not a 2 on it, okay? But there is, as anyone in this room has ever dealt with real estate markets, a tremendous uncertainty in a statement like that. We're talking about selling some buildings in a future market. The good news is that if the price is better than we think it might be, and we think we're estimating these things reasonably conservatively, if the price is better than these things, we would get extra cash to make sure we can really do these projects. If the price is less than that, we don't have to sell at a fire sale price. But basically, we think that in the latter part of this decade, we might be funding the last portions of this and moving forward. So this is not, we anticipate, decades of hoping and that you're going to have access to this greenway. I just want to mention for the folks who have some who have been thinking about this break-even value. The reason this transaction might make sense from the perspective of the city, from a purely financial perspective, is that UN 1 and 2 are not worth that much money as marketable properties as long as tenants are in them who have a right to stay there for a long time and not pay market rent. Okay? So one of the reasons that this transaction might work, if it works, is because by creating new space for the UN will give up those below market leases. Okay? And for those who are thinking about this break-even value, the amount of money the city gets, their current cash flow, is going to be offset by any additional proceeds that the city gets from allowing them allowing the city to start charging market rent. So even before those buildings are sold, the city is going to be getting more money than they would otherwise get. The community gets full credit for that money because basically the amount of money the city is going to need when the sale is made is going to drop over time. So there is a point where in this transaction, if we go on for a few years, where the city is getting the first dollars from the sale of UN 1 and 2, as well as the first dollars from the Robert Moses Playground. And I'm sure that lost a few people in this room, and perhaps even lost Councilmember Grodnick, who's a lot smarter than me. But I think I'm going to end there, and we're now going to hear from Senator Liz Krueger about